Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to make a few remarks. Difficulty is restricting the remarks within the 10 minutes time slot, so I'm going to try to achieve that. I'm going to spend like probably 5 minutes on this slide and then quickly show some picture type slides after this. First of all, I think my remarks are sort of intended to be mostly trying to bridge the discussions we had in the morning between the health data set and then the study design and epidemiological statistical methodology issues that are going to follow after this panel. So that what are the key determinants of accountability studies that we think might be influencing or impacting the monitoring and modeling needs and hence the network design. We have to consider multiple factors as already been sort of touched upon. It's really not a two-dimensional or three-dimensional problem. It's an n-dimensional multi-component framework for assessing what we need for a given type of an accountability study. I mean, already Brian and the others talked about the intervention, short-term, acute study, and then try to sort of stratify those in some cohesive fashion. So the first thing, of course, is the spatial domains, and not only X, Y, but we're talking about satellites, and the Z comes in. And then the temporal dimensions, acute versus long-term effects due to short-term versus long-term exposure situations. As Neil Frank just mentioned very correctly, because of the reductions that are taking place now in terms of the regional sort of levels on the PM2.5, we are seeing the local source contributions are sort of becoming important. So what are we talking about in terms of accountability? So are we talking about PM2.5 or PM2.5 components? Some of them could be traffic related and as well as regional. And then the co-pollutant gases. I mean, these have to be either direct independent variables or covariates in the accountability studies sort of dealt with. And then, of course, these are all ambient-related values, and ultimately we're looking at the right surrogate for human exposures. And Mike and Jeremy Mike Brower and Jeremy Sarnett touched upon that issue, exposure and exposure-related factors, and how that are really important, especially in terms of not only temporal trends that are taking place in terms of some of these behavioral or housing stock factors, but also spatial factors that are really important, especially when we're talking about within urban area variations of the exposure indicators. The air exchange rates are influenced by the housing stock, use of air conditioning, et cetera. And indeed, what we're showing in our recent work that we've conducted with multiple universities under ORD Neuro-Cooperative Agreement, that they're actually effect modifiers for PM2.5 concentration response relationships for myocardial infections and hospital admissions, et cetera. So these are actually important. In addition to time in traffic and commuting, of course, is going to be a determinant factor for PM components and NOx and CO as well. And in terms of health data, we did not get into that much breakdown, I don't think, this morning in terms of what level of health data we're talking about. The attributes of health data and limitations have to be also considered. First of all, there's city level, metropolitan level aggregate data that has been used. There's MSA level data, and then you can go to finer spatial resolution, zip code, or census tract level. And clearly, as you can expect, the finer resolution you have, you can be able to test some of these accountability hypotheses that are more directed to certain PM species or components much more efficiently or with stronger power. Epidemiological study design issues and methodological considerations, of course, going to be discussed further, but just wanted to mention my little remark on that one is, for example, the stuff that we've looked at in terms of exposure indicator applications to various types of air pollution analysis, case crossover versus time series versus logit, etc. etc., does matter in terms of not just the statistical methodology and how it fares in terms of the concentration response relationship analysis, but also if you're looking at population exposures, actually turns out case crossover analysis is not as fruitful as time series analysis, which I don't have time to talk about why that is. The next item is the monitoring and sensor technology issues. I mean, we talked a lot about how, I think Neil also mentioned, how to sort of use specialty monitoring networks for research purposes or other types of local community investigations of air pollution health impact. But then there is other component that I think we need to focus is that the up-and-coming monitoring and sensor technologies, which are lightweight, nanotechnology, or other GPS-based methods that are emerging and for the past decade is getting into wide use that can be deployed in large numbers of locations to provide us spatial coverage that we need. And some of them are actually being done by participatory studies by community volunteers. And in terms of satellite work data, there's Mike Jarrett from Berkeley and Petros from Harvard that already looked at how to sort of employ them and demonstrated this fair amount of reliability. In a special issue of Jesse, where we're presenting these other studies that I touched upon earlier, there's an article by Naresh Kumar that's also using PM2.5 data in conjunction with satellite data in Cleveland and applying it to COPD health analysis with some good success. So a final remark I have is that, it's not on this slide, is that we also consider, I think, which I didn't hear this morning, stimulation type studies a priori to test feasibility of alternative study designs for accountability. And we've done one of those in the New Haven area in an EHB article 2 years ago. So if we can skip a couple of slides. And smartphone, yeah, that one. So about 2 years ago, Ron Williams and I organized a session at the International Society of Exposure Science meeting at Baltimore, looking at new sensor technologies to sort of assess what's available, what their pluses and applications limitations might be. This is intended to show basically an example of a technology which will be the ideal goal for an ultimate sensor. Namely, it has to be cheap, small, and of course reliable and accurate. This is not intended, the one in the picture, for air pollution, but it shows that if a lot of people put their head together, a few thousand people led by folks from MIT under the acronym of PLOTS, developed a smartphone spectrometer which generates absorption spectra of substances such as oils and soil particles with a simple card that you can attach to your smartphone and turn it into a spectrophotometer. And the cost for this is only $10 for the members who've already put it startup funds of $35. So we're talking about very cheap devices that can be readily deployed, in this case for spectrophotometric analysis. And there are counterparts on the air pollution side as well. There is the, of course, RTI's personal environmental monitor that does battery operated, even though the costs are slightly higher than the $10 we're talking about here. Next one. So in the past few decades, there has been major advances in information technology. And I'm actually impressed by Google Maps and Google X, which is their research arm, come up with these very interesting and very powerful tools. And most of you are familiar that if you enable your traffic view in your Google Maps, you can get these color-coded based traffic flow rates on a real-time basis, which are based on how many people are using their cell phone and the accelerometer information that's already in most of the high-end cell phones. Like, for example, green is easy sailing, no traffic, yellow is slow moving, and red is basically gridlock. actually turn that into quantitative and real-time categories of traffic. And I was really excited about this thing, and I was surprised that, my colleagues at ORD, Neural at least, have not really paid too much attention to this. But I hope that EPA and somebody soon will pick up on this thing, because the vehicle fleet and vehicle traffic and emissions modeling is a key component of local scale modeling, and the inventory emissions data that we have, of course, have limitations and clearly does not have the temporal resolution as these types of data sets. So next one, please. We have done, based on GPS tracking devices in our lab, Michael Green and colleagues developed a MicroTrac device using, again, a cell phone type of methodology to estimate the time of day and duration in the microenvironment. And it not only gets the position and speed timelines from a GPS data logger, but also they utilize in their software in the analysis mode, they mark the boundaries of buildings using Google Earth. So we'll skip one and then go to the next one. Yeah, so basically they use the Google Earth and then sort of fit the templates of school, home, and workplace so they can count how much time in and away from these structures in sort of mapping into 7 or 8 different types of microenvironments, and the sampling time is 5 seconds or so. But the impressive thing is that they have come up with since you're dealing with reams and reams of data, come up with a software that can reduce fairly semi-automatically, I would say, the information at the individual level. Next slide, please, which will be the final one. At the individual level to come up with time spent in indoors at home, indoors outdoors, outdoors at home, work indoors, in vehicles, school indoors, school outdoors. And then they have a way of flagging using the GPS that the subject uses the waypoints to actually determine or mark the time spent in a given microenvironment. So the comparison is quite good. So, of course, we are interested in method detection limits, accuracy, and precision for most of the pollution sensors with these new methodologies, and Ron Williams and others in Neural are actually locating some of these new samplers to see how well they compare with FRMs. And hopefully, I think when these technologies become more mature in probably less than 5 years, they can be deployed in a larger scale to supplement and enhance the existing monitoring data, so that almost like a hierarchical Bayesian analysis can be done, not only just fusing the monitoring data with the sensor data, but also modeling data, satellite data, and other types of exposure-related information and housing-related information as well along those lines. So that's my hope and the optimistic conclusion.
Okay.